Metro Supply Chain is the official sponsor of the Ask the Experts Theater at Edge 23. Pioneering the future of supply chain with investments in advanced automation, robotics, and business intelligence, Metro Supply Chain delivers innovative, real-world supply chain solutions that advance business. Learn more at metroscg.com.
Hello. I would like to welcome you to the Ask the Experts Theater, sponsored by Metro Supply Chain. For 50 years, Metro Supply Chain has an innovative end-to-end supply chain solutions, and we've been driving business for growth for many of the most recognizable brands in the world. We're the largest privately owned contract logistics provider in Canada, with more than 100 operations in North America and the United Kingdom. We are the strategic supply chain partner of choice for leading consumer goods, industrial organizations, retail, and requiring scalable and data-driven omni-chain experience that will fast-forward their business. My name is Sarah Opperman. I am the Senior Director of Business Development for Supply Chain in the U.S. I'm responsible for innovating tailored and innovative solutions, also increasing profits through efficiencies. It is my great pleasure to welcome you tonight and to introduce Ms. Linda Dunn. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to talk a little bit loud because I need to, right? So first, welcome, and thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm here to talk about a topic I'm really passionate about and to give you some insights on it, and that is improving the effectiveness of workplace communications and really strengthening them. So as you can probably see by my title, I'm faculty director, and actually I'm a professor as well for the Supply Chain Management program at Georgetown University in their School of Continuing Studies. So let me ask you, why is someone like me, who's in the supply chain profession, in academia, not talking about economic order quantity or ABC inventory? Why am I talking about communications? Any ideas? And I'm going to do this like a class. Yeah, go ahead. It's important. Absolutely. It's critical. And I think those who've really been in the business know. And what I would also say, let me use this, is a little bit about my background. I haven't been in academia my whole life, right? I've been there 4 years only. I've spent most of my life in industry. My last position, I was Vice President of Supply Chain and Quality Assurance for HMS Host. We do restaurants, and they also do retail, mainly in airports. You might see it on the back of the receipt, right? I did North America. So I spent many, many years in the trenches dealing with the things that everyone has had to deal with here, pandemic, et cetera. And I saw how important communications were. And also, when you think about it, I asked leaders and I have asked students what matters. Inevitably, communications comes up at the individual level, it comes up at the departmental level, and the organizational level. Today, I'm just going to address mainly organizational level. We could certainly get into individual communications. There might be a little bit on that when I talk about feedback. All right? So what we're basically going to cover are these areas. One, I want to talk about what constitutes effective communication, and then really tease out through some survey and research that I did. We did some quantitative research, but don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with statistics, but I am going to share a few charts that share some information, and then secondary research. What's unique is that if you think about it with supply chain professionals, there's not a lot of research on organizational communications. There is in general, and there are wonderful sources between SHRM, Society for Human Resource Management, Gallup, et cetera, and I'll talk about some of those resources. But supply chain itself hasn't really been looked at that much. Again, we're going to tease out some of the findings and what we saw in the research and the secondary research. And then I always say anyone can find a problem, right? You want someone who can solve the problem. So there will also be what are the gaps, but what are the action steps that can be taken to help close the gaps? And then lastly, just open it up for Q&A. And I'll try to either repeat your question or invite you up so that we can have a little fun with this. So let me ask you, and again, I've done this in a fashion, any thoughts that come to mind on what do these four people have in common? Great speakers, absolutely. Anything else come to mind? Influencers, absolutely. So good answers there. And what you can see, one thing is I would say they all have authenticity. That makes them really credible, right? They have a unique message, and I'm saying still in the present tense, although some are deceased, because they still have that message out there, right? So they have a really unique message, and they know how to resonate with their audience. As a matter of fact, and you may know this already, but Martin Luther King Jr., when he was giving his very famous I Have a Dream speech, midway through, he stopped looking at his notes. Someone maybe yelled out and said, Martin Luther, tell him about the dream. That changed everything and became one of the most famous and important speeches in the United States. So he knew his audience. He knew the message he needed to get to them. And something else these people have in common is their use of nonverbal communication, right? So intonation. Has anyone ever heard Maya Angelou speak? Yes, right? Yes, amazing, amazing intonation with her voice. Absolutely love her. And then also, if you look at three of these people, they have their hands right up. What do you think that means? Expressive? Absolutely, it is expressive. It's using more than just their voice. Honest, yes. And part of that is transparency and openness. Those are the open hands. Some people think it was like, okay, I don't have anything to hide, right? But open hands can come different ways. Very, very important nonverbal communication. As a matter of fact, there was a very interesting research in Frontiers of Psychology. A bunch of researchers were looking at nonverbal characteristics, and they were able to, through the use of AI, really filming people, things you couldn't even notice or pick up. It could be a lip curl or something like that, right? They found 75 different nonverbal communication methods. So it could be hands, it could be voice, it could be the way you raise your head, the way you tilt your head. All of this matters in communications. So they really had this message. And that gets to the point of needing a goal, right? The goal could be as simple as, okay, I just need to inform someone, right? Pretty straightforward. It could be, I need to understand something. I better ask some open-ended questions so I get a better sense, right? Maybe I need to persuade. I want action out of this. Or maybe I just want to connect. I want there to be a relationship that comes out of this communication. They all differ, and sometimes you can have more than one goal, right? So let me ask a scenario. Let's just say, and I think this has happened in supply chain, inflation is really, really high. CEO goes to the chief supply chain officer and says, you need to cut product costs another 10%. Mind you, there's already been initiatives, right? And I need you to do it, wrap it into your MBOs. Next thing you know, the chief supply chain officer is hearing water cooler talk that people already know about this extra 10%, needs to get a communication out. What might be their goals or some of their goals? Is it just to inform? No. Yeah, it's stop the rumor mill, right? So it might be also to empathize. People have gone through a lot of change, right? If you're just ignoring the fact that they have given a lot and put a lot out there, saying, here's another 10%, there's no relationship building in that communication, is there? What about different departments? Maybe marketing isn't so fond of your decision to reduce product costs because they know something might have to go down from what they want, right? Maybe they were trying to roll out something that was more expensive, and the product mix would make your cost of product go up. So again, you might need to persuade these groups. It's necessary. Why? So it's really focusing on two things. Who is your audience, and what do you want the communication to do? Again, who is your audience, and what do you want the communication to do? That seems pretty straightforward, but the reality is that organizational communications are somewhat complex, right? They're not just one-on-one, although that's a part of organizational communication, right? Stopping by someone's desk is part of organizational communication. But when you look at it, you have a diverse audience. You might have these different functions, like I was saying, marketing, finance has one thing, R&D has another idea, supply chain, even within supply chain, your procurement department, your planning department, your logistics department, all might have some different ideas, right? And then you have everything from geographical and cultural differences, as well as differences in just number of years of experience and knowledge on the subject, right? So it's very complex based on this diverse audience. You also have upward and downward communication. Rarely should communication be one way. And I'm going to talk about cascading, but there's also that feedback loop, right? And cascading is very interesting. You could have, from the CEO, they could have their direct reports talk about communication or initiative and expect everyone to cascade it. And maybe it goes down to then the SVPs, and then it goes down to the VPs, and then it goes down to the senior directors. So what can happen as you're cascading communications? Telephone, right? Anyone's heard of the telephone game where you sit in a circle? By the time it gets around, it can be nonsense almost, right? Cascading has that risk. It also has the risk that it never happens. One department says, my boss didn't say that. Anyone experienced that before? Yeah. So all of this makes it more complex, as well as multiple channels. So when I say multiple channels, you can put this on, an announcement board. You can have, before someone gets to their computer, they have to click, they've seen the announcement. There's email, there's meetings, so many different channels now with all the technology that's out there. Makes it a bit complicated. But what I'm going to share is that besides what I'll call the structural complications to organizational communications, there's some other things that are happening. Namely, if you look and you try to understand a message when it goes out, a message when it's received, and then maybe parrot it again, there's things that can get in the way. And two I'm going to talk about are bias and poor practices. First, with poor practices, I'm going to go through that a little bit with the research, but again, it could be anything from didn't happen to too many emails that they're not even relevant to me. And we heard that through some of the survey results, just sort of blanket emails going out to everyone because it's easier. Maybe your systems can't divide the different groups easily, right? You have a lot of poor practices that can be out there in communications. But bias is another one. So when I say bias, Visual Capitalist did a great thing in 2020. They published like the 50 common cognitive biases. So when I talk about bias, it could be that you have a confirmation bias, which means when I read it or hear it, I'm basically going to read the portion that confirms what I already believe, right? That happens all the time, in business and not in business, right? That's a confirmation bias. Could be recency bias, similar to when you have performance appraisals. Well, what just happened? Well, that's going to influence how someone receives and decodes your message. Lots of different types. There's also curse of knowledge bias, which is you think everyone has the same knowledge you do, but they don't, right? So maybe you don't explain it very well. So I'm going to tell a quick but personal story. So I have 3 daughters. My middle daughter, we dropped off at University of Florida. We're coming back, and we usually make it a 2-day trip. Well, it's 11 at night. We're not sure where we should stop, but I have a meeting the next day. I don't want to take it. I don't know about you, but I don't want to take it on the road. I don't want to take it in the car. So I say, let's push on. I'm driving. There's a truck here by 11 o'clock at night. It's mainly the truckers and a few car drivers, right? Everyone else has stopped. Well, we're there. My husband would rather stop somewhere. And then he's a little worried about my 15-year-old who came with us, right? So he leans over and he says, Jessica, Mom doesn't want to stop for the night. Can you make it? Well, there's this huge pause. And then slowly she says, I think I can. And I'm thinking, you mean you can't just sleep in the back of the van or in the back seat? What's going on? So I asked that high-gain question. What do you mean by you think you can? Comes to be that we find out she thought we wanted her to drive the rest of the way home. Why? One is that the communications are often unclear. What does it mean? Can you make it? What does it mean? Good job. Very unclear, right? And we were absolutely unclear. Second is that bias or context I was talking about. Each person comes to listening with their own set of what's happened to them. So for her, earlier that day on campus, we'd forgotten about it, but we were talking about with her learners, she should get a few more hours. But I don't think I'd put her on 95 with all the truckers as her first hours, right? But again, this reminder is that communications are often unclear, and each person has some bias when they're coming to the communication. With that, and I'm not going to go into great detail, but I'm going to talk about a 7 attributes communication model I like to use when I think of effective communications. What does that look like? And one of the ways I like to look at what something is also by what is it not, right? Sort of juxtapose the two. First of all, when you're targeting something, it means that it is relevant, right? And I just talked about there's too many emails that people might send that aren't pertinent to someone, right? So when that happens, people just tune out. They lose their email, they don't read the message. So it needs to be curated to the audience. That makes it targeted. And you need to know, what did I say? Who is your audience and what do you want the communication to do? It also needs to be authentic. And I talked about authentic with the speakers, right? Martin Luther King Jr., Maya Angelou, Brene Brown with her vulnerability, right? Very, very authentic. So it could be the message that makes it authentic, but it could also be the wrong messenger that makes it unauthentic. So if you have to make big cuts in supply chain, right? Maybe you're cutting some staff in operations. Do you send the VP or director of HR? Does the head of operations make that announcement, right? Or the department's affected directly? So messenger matters, and it's part of authenticity. Distill just means get to the message quickly. I know that when I had to go to operations and say, hey, there's an action, whether it be a recall, whether it be some step that we needed them to do for labeling or whatever, I found out very quickly I should put in the subject, action needed. The idea that they were going to read to the bottom of the memo, no. And what I usually tell my students is make sure you're putting the most important part at the top of the memo, because many people will not read any further than the first paragraph or two, right? So you got to make it compelling that they're actually going to read the memo. You want it timely. This is that the information isn't already known, right? And then also, if you think about it, has anyone here actually found out that maybe, well, not personally, but you know someone, and I have, that found out that a job was being filled from the outside, but maybe they had gone for the job? Oh, I see actually lots of nods on that. That isn't structured in the right cascading. Those most impacted should know first, right? That's timely. Intentional, it should be scheduled. It doesn't mean you won't have ad hoc, but you can't just allow it to happenstance. It has to have a schedule around it. Empathetic, you don't want to sound tone deaf. I talked about, cutting the product costs after someone has gone through a lot of change. You need to show that empathy to even begin to get them to agree that they want to work on this, right? And to persuade. And then two-way is really, yes, there are times, and we're going to talk about cascading communications, which are going from the top really down. But if there's no feedback link, how do you know that was actually received, right? In the medical profession, they call it closed-loop communication. One person says it, and you repeat it back. Why? To know the message was received and not have errors. There still needs to be ways, whether it's talk to your department head, and I'm going to talk to some of them and make sure that you understood. Maybe there's a box for questions that you get after a meeting or something like that, but you need to get some level of two-way feedback, even for cascading communications. So with that, I want to talk about the survey a little bit, right? So we did a primary survey, and a big shout out for Council to Supply Chain Management Professionals and DC Velocity, because what they let me do is use their subscriber base, so I really got supply chain professionals. I didn't want to put it out there and someone might say, yes, I'm a supply chain professional, but they weren't. Most of the people subscribing to those magazines and in the membership here are in supply chain in some capacity. So we put that out. It's a quantitative survey, but it also had open-ended questions, which provided a wealth of sort of nuanced understanding of why they checked certain things that they did. We had 160 respondents to that. And what I will say, just for disclosure, is it's more U.S.-centric. Even though Council for Supply Chain Management Professionals and DC Velocity has an international base, the respondent profile was more U.S. So I want to say that this is more U.S.-centric, okay? It also skews a little bit older. I don't think you have as many hourly workers in that base. So those are sort of the two caveats with the study participants. And then there was secondary research, and also observations and interviews, right? That in 30 years of experience here, quite a few. So the first of three takeaways I'm going to share is that strong communications improve business results. And I don't mean just the fluffy stuff. I mean the hard business results. What you see is increased employee engagement. You see increased productivity, reduced absenteeism, higher retention. And then those flow into the deliverables, right? These are all connected. Fewer mistakes, less rework, and higher customer satisfaction. The golden cup, right? Customer satisfaction. And when you look at some of the response, this is the surveys, 85% of respondents indicated that cascading communications, this is communications coming down from their leadership, had some impact on their engagement. And we use the words attitude, enthusiasm, belonging, right? It's really the attachment that someone has to the organization. That's 85%. When we look then away from feeling, more at how they felt it impacted their business results, we found 70% of respondents said cascading information can impact their job performance personally, right? So they felt that it was necessary for that. We then wanted to say, okay, we know that, we've seen a lot with the Great Resignation and the quiet quitting, and I don't know how many more terms there can be, but there's lots of them, right? Employees are at a different state than they used to. So we asked people, what is your likelihood, or within the last 6 months, have you considered leaving your current company, all right? And we found about a third said yes, and if we count the ones who just said, I don't want to answer. And I will say this was an anonymous survey. We could not even track IP addresses on purpose. It's intended to give, you want truth coming out of surveys, it's anonymous. But if I take that other group, it's about 40%. That is very in line with lots of other research where you see anything from 40 to 60% of individuals saying they're thinking of leaving their current company. And if you want to calculate sort of hard results from that, a theoretical case right here, or just to build on it, is to show that flight risk employees are substantially not as satisfied with internal communications. And this is on many metrics when we measured it. So in this case, you see 20% for those who are thinking about leaving are satisfied versus 44% who are not thinking about leaving. 23% who are not thinking about leaving are extremely satisfied. They're really high level versus only 9%. So these are very big numbers and differences between the two groups, right? And it was on many questions. We asked, what do you perceive your receptiveness to your organization, to your ideas, to your thoughts and suggestions? Again, this dichotomy between those thinking of leaving and those who plan to stay. And this was supply chain in professionals, but this is also echoed overall. And if you take this to sort of a business case, let's just get financial for a minute, and this is theoretical, but SHRM has an average cost for a new hire, and they use $4,700 based on their benchmarking survey that they've just done. Again, Society for Human Resource Management. Some figures show a lot more than $4,700 person to rehire. But with that, if you just take a medium to slightly larger company of $4,500, do the math, move 2 percentage points, just 2, you'll see that you're at over $400,000. This is annually in hard savings just from the retention. So these are business results. But very often, you don't see in a company that there's an internal comm person, right? There might be a PR person. There might be a person that is HR, but it's all disparate. It's not looked at as one single organizational communications internally. But there's money here, right? There's money on the table. And the indirect costs are even higher. So let's just take one of those 90 people, and let's pretend that they were in the sourcing organization and they headed up indirect spend. They were the category manager for indirect spend. Well, are you going to be able to do as many sourcing events? How long does it take to hire, right? So you really are talking about a lot of bigger when you think of the indirect as well. There's also institutional knowledge that's going out the door. Maybe they know the suppliers. They've done the landscape. They understand sort of what to expect back. Client relationships are another one. So even if you have a non-compete that you make your employees sign, the reality is they could be customers that eventually walk out the door too if your national sales account rep leaves. And then just what other employees feel, right? So a lot of indirect impacts, even greater, which is why I think some of the research and statistics will show a lot more than $4,700 per person. So the second big, I just talked about sort of hard results. The second big takeaway is that communications, they really form the other big C, culture. And it is part of the organization's connective tissue to have the communications. When it's done very well, we would see comments like this in the survey. We are a well-oiled, connected company. Wouldn't you love to hear your employees say that, right? But on the opposite side, when people were unhappy, you would see things like this, where they're basically saying people stay in their offices. It's not even about being remote. They're in their offices. They only communicate if they have to. There's silos. Information's not widely shared. Very common comments for people who weren't happy. This also has a trust factor. Trust, there's so many books, Speed of Trust, lots of different things. But when you look at it, again, some quotes, they're anonymous, but they're from different people. When people were pleased with the communications, highly satisfied, not looking to leave, you hear, we have frequent and tailored communications. Transparency is a word that came up again and again and again from the survey respondents, either having transparency or a lack thereof. So on the other side, you saw, this was almost horrible to see. I have a feeling that important topics are hidden, right? Communication is slow and not widely shared. If data is the new oil, I think communication is oil on steroids in a way, right? Because it's what you do with things. So it really is something that can build or hurt trust. The other thing is we just looked at the cascading communications, but if you actually look at, feedback and recognition that employees are giving, some are living in a feedback desert. So you see 33% have received positive feedback less than once a month or never. More or less than a month. Never was under 10%. And then when you start to get to say, what about coaching and giving ideas on how to improve performance? Well, there you see nearly half, 44%, got constructive feedback less than once a month or never. Let me just put this in a scenario terms. Let's say you hired or you started a women's soccer team, right? You're paying all the players, you're paying the coach, and you're out there, the coach is watching all the games, and they give feedback to the players every 40 days. Would you keep that coach? Should you keep that coach? Right? I'm not saying it's as intensive as the sports coaching, but we're leaving people out there in the wind, right? So the coaching, and there's a lot, when you look at this next slide, and again, there's so much on this area, and even in our survey, people said, it has an impact on me. But Gallup on their website, really when it hits the mark, that recognition, people are 5 times more likely to be connected to the organization, 4 times more likely to be engaged. And we talk about how that hits productivity, less absenteeism, more initiative. And that's down here at Zippy as well, which is like a online recruiting firm. You will see these statistics in many places, but what are we doing? We're leaving the people behind, so to speak. We're not giving the level of recognition and coaching. And I'm going to go through 5 steps that can help with that. The first is to provide specific and actionable feedback. Let me ask you this. You have an employee. They did a great job of a meeting. Is great job specific and actionable? I'm seeing more no than yes, all right? What could be more specific? What? Yeah, how they did a good job, exactly. Good job, they might not really understand. You could say, hey, you did an amazing job with that presentation. You had so many facts that supported the business case that everyone bought into it. Great job. The great job should be at the beginning or the end, but not the full statement, right? Same thing if you got a report from one of your direct reports and you say, oh, thank you for the report. Yes, you're being kind and acknowledging them, but what behavior are they going to do again, right? What do you want to be done again? If you say something like, thank you for getting me that report early, they now know that behavior early is important to you, right? Or maybe it's clear or it's organized. Whatever you want them to repeat, you need to say. And when you look at it, these all fold into one another, but Carol Dweck is a psychologist, and she talks about focusing on the process, not the person, and the growth mindset. Has anyone heard about the growth mindset? Yeah, I see a few hands. Yep. And it's really about saying, don't tell employees or your children that, don't praise them for innate things like, hey, you're just smart. You want to praise them for the process, because then, neural plasticity, they're going to figure out how to get to doing well, that it's a process, not, I can't control it. I have no ability whether I'm good or bad because I'm just born with it, right? Focusing on the process is really important. So that's something she's done a lot of research on. You also see Ken Blanchard saying, one of my favorite phrases is, catch people doing something right? Because then they want to repeat that behavior. I mean, it's like our brains, it's all chemistry, right? Wow, I got endorphins. I got really excited because someone gave me praise. I want that feeling again, right? There's a reason for that. So giving those positives, you will see that there's about a 5-to-1 ratio you should give. Sounds like a lot, but 5 positives to 1 negative. And this is really coming out of SHRM and some of the research that they have done. This is the author that did the article, but you'll see this repeated. I've seen up to 7-to-1 ratio. 5-to-1 is probably pretty good. I've actually, when I was working, kept a little journal. Who did I give praise to and when, right? Because by nature, I'm more critical, and I know that. I'm not the woo when you do the strength finder. I'm not. I'm going to find the thing. I think it's supply chain innate, maybe. We find the issues and we try to fix them. So I'm a little critical, and I knew I needed to be more positive, right? All the research says it. You can track it, you can improve it, but it takes intentionality. We've talked about feedback being timely. If it's not right after what happens, people forget, right? They don't know if it's as valid. And then again, you want to communicate with intention. When I talked about writing things down or knowing, this same SHRM article talks about women of color get less feedback. Well, what are we trying to do if we're trying to increase equity and diversity, but we're not giving the right level of feedback to people, right? So intentionality means let's look at who I'm talking to, and let's look at whose desk I stop by and the comments that I give people, and make sure that I'm doling it out to everyone, not just people I'm comfortable with or my favorite 2 people I work with, right? We also wanted to look at, I just talked about top-down communications. We're kind of going all around, right? And then boss to peer, but it's also peer-to-peer and interdepartmental. We asked, how often have you not received information from a colleague or another department that you need to perform the job to the best of your ability? And if you look at that, 21% said frequently, 6% all the time, right? So again, when we talk about the big C of culture, having this kind of communication that interdepartmentally isn't that great really hurts results, initiatives. I think one of them said, I think our department is always the last to know, right? That's the way they felt about communications in their organization. And I would also say that companies, we asked about topics, and they do want to know how the company is doing, and that's very important. But the lowest rating, and this wasn't just for those leaving and not leaving, was on personal development. Like, are you advertising your open positions? Are you telling people how they can get training? That is becoming more and more important to employees as they look to move ahead and as you look to be competitive in the workplace. And that was the area they were the most dissatisfied on. It was like 22% said that their companies did a poor job in that area. And then lastly, because I know on time here, we want to make sure we can get in a few questions. But the third takeaway is really that organizational communications must be intentional, which I've already said, but it must be driven by leadership. This is not something you can just delegate. I am a proponent of having an internal comms person, but that's what isn't where all the communication should come from, right? It needs to come from leadership. We actually asked people, rank, what's the method? How would you like to receive communications? This was a little surprising to me with all the different methods. The very top one was sort of that all staff meeting or all team meeting that's out there, right? People want the nonverbal. People want to be able to ask questions. They want to see their leadership driving this, not delegated. The second choice for, again, first preference would be team meetings, departmental meetings. But people, the whole idea of having, that larger meeting where people get together, they get to hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, not to call leadership horses, but from, from the people who are really leading was important. So that was a little bit surprising. Frequency, of course, is important. This wasn't real bad, but you can see there's definitely more where there's infrequent than not. And then when you're looking at timeliness, you would see things like the grapevine, is faster but more biased. So we got to get out there, and here's a couple ways to do it. So I want to shift into things you can do. But before that, I'm going to talk about one more impact. I've talked a lot about the organization, the results, the individual. I would also say, and this may sound a little heavy, that there's a societal impact from how organizations are operated. So it's not just limited to the companies. 4 in 10 U.S. workers share that their job is having a negative effect on their mental health. And this was Gallup and Well Workforce. Also, you have in May, the Surgeon General come out and declare loneliness and isolation an epidemic. These are figures that have eroded and gotten worse. One of the countermeasures in his advisory is really that to make social connection a strategic priority in the workplace at all levels. So I would say some of what we're seeing in the organization is spilling over to society. There are many people where we call it the workplace family. You could have the, work husband or the work wife, right? Someone you're spending more time than your spouse with, because that's what your business calls for at times, right? With that, how do we close these gaps, right? There are lots of different issues here. Well, one, there's often an intention-action gap. You can say that for many, many things. I intend to do it, but I'm too busy. I intend to do it, but I don't know I have the skills or the resources. The first is really measurement. Know what you're doing today, right? That's with most processes. Measure what you're doing today. You'll then set your goals, and then you'll do feedback. And this path that I have here is just a reminder to not let perfect stop the path to better, right? You want it so perfect that no one can say anything bad about your communication. Well, guess what? It's got to get out there too, right? It's got to be timely. It's got to be relevant. Yes, there's a risk someone might be left out, but to not communicate is worse. So starting with a diverse communications team, this would include not just senior level people, but you need to get newer employees involved in understanding, measuring, and talking about communication in your organization, and less senior, right? Because you can't do this from the top down. There's a gap between, what leadership thinks is happening and what's really happening. So you need to build that team diverse. You need to map out the current processes. We all know flow charts and diagrams, and you can do how often it happens and where it's coming from and who's communicating, and then develop a calendar and a plan. Again, this is the intentionality behind it. You'll have ad hoc. That's great. That's going to happen, but making sure that you're actually planning for it. And then training. Do your employees know the 5-to-1 ratio? Do your employees know how important feedback is and how often they should be giving feedback? Do your employees understand their role in communications and how it's part of the bigger culture within, and that they're communicating, again, to all of their employees with intentionality? So again, I'm not going to go through all of these again, but the 7 attributes is, I don't like checklist as a word, but it's a way to at least gauge as you're doing your auditing. Okay, have I done this? Is it authentic? Is it intentional, etc.? So my 4-point recap before we do Q&A. One is remember the van story, right? Communications are often unclear and received with bias and personal context, right? Expect that there are issues with the communications. Second is really strong communications will improve business results, hard results, retention, performance, productivity. There's a business case behind it. Third is that communications, again, it builds the big C. It builds the connective tissue of the organization. It helps hold it together, particularly when things are tough, right? You need culture when times are tough. And then really the fourth is just organizational communications must be intentional and, again, must be driven by leadership, not delegated. Right? So hopefully this has been a little bit helpful in talking about workplace communications, because it's important to supply chain, as we've talked about, right? And it's important for your organization's performance and for the employee and the society. And with that, also please fill out, if you do at the end of this, the session that talks about, how you felt about it. I appreciate feedback, and honestly, I appreciate constructive feedback as well. As I said, it's important to get all types. And I'll open up to questions and answers. So any questions that come about based on what I've talked about? No? What? Excellent question. So the question was, it focused a lot on top-down organizational communications, but what about from bottom up? We did ask a few questions, and that would be great next research, I'll say. But we did ask, how satisfied are you with your organization's willingness to listen to you, your suggestions, and we also asked about their how satisfied they were with the methods they have. And what I would say is the two groups that I talked about, the ones that are willing to stay and those that are willing to go, definitely had differences in satisfactions with the bottom up as well. But I think a lot more research could be done on best practices associated with bottoms up, because it's not, you can have anything from focus groups. I found a lot personally from doing focus groups with employees at different levels, and it's like, oh, we didn't realize you felt this way, right? Or that you didn't get communicated about this. So I think that would be a nice next, sort of second phase. But we asked a few questions, and I would say those two groups had the dichotomy of how satisfied they were with current methods. Good question. Yes. I will use the microphone next time. It's a very good question. So she asked, a lot of times companies, they send out these surveys. Many companies do engagement surveys, right? And then they might share the results and where I need to focus on, but there's that action intention gap, which is basically what you're saying. And that absolutely happens. It takes organizations, and actually it takes employees, and you're talking about this, actually telling their leadership, hey, I don't think that we really heard this, or nothing really happened with these ideas. It's actually the reason why some organizations are, hesitant to share results and what that needs to be done, because they're afraid they're going to be held accountable for the results. That okay, what if I can't get to it? The key is usually for an organization to find at least some quick wins. So maybe something structurally will take some time, but to find quick wins on how to improve the organizational communications, and then again to measure. And if there isn't the progress, that is leadership in essence, is being able to look at something as it really exists and envision how and make it change. So I will say we don't always have leadership where it needs to be, but the right leaders will be able to use those tools to make changes. But as employees, hold them accountable too. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. This has been great. Thank you.